Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Jamie Stratton, one of the medical oncologists at the Bennett Cancer Center, and I am honored to be here with you tonight for this very special virtual fundraising event. I would like to take a moment to thank the Tastings Committee for their support and dedication to creating tonight's very special program. I would also like to give a special shout out to La Roca's Country Market for donating the shepherd's pie, Beldotti's Bakery for providing the cookies, and Giovanna's Wine and Spirits for their donation of the Tanqueray. Tonight's virtual event benefits the Hope in Motion Walk and Run. The funds raised will provide some amazing supportive programs. Our transportation program, which provides rides to and from treatment, the nourishment program, which provides daily lunches to patients while undergoing chemotherapy, grants for non-medical expenses, and integrative medicine services that are all funded by donors such as you. As a physician, I can attest to the tremendous impact that these programs have on our patients and know how deeply grateful they are to get this type of support. I feel fortunate to be at a cancer center that can provide these types of services at no charge to our patients, thanks to the funds raised. There are two ways you can help raise money during the program. One is through our online raffle. There are some great items to be won. You will see a QR code at the bottom of the screen. Take a picture of that code with your cell phone, and it will automatically take you to the page to purchase raffle tickets. Tickets are 1 for $25, 3 for $50, and 7 for $100. We hope you will also donate to our Fund a Need, which funds supportive services to our cancer patients. Scan the QR code with your phone and select the level that you want to pledge. On behalf of everyone at the Bennett Cancer Center, we hope you enjoy your virtual tour and thank you again for your generous support. It is now my pleasure to turn the program over to our featured guest and guide all the way from London, England, Anne Pollock Elser. Anne has graciously donated her time and talent to giving us a special look inside at some of the greatest London pubs. Anne is a Blue Badge tour guide. Thank you for this exciting virtual tour.
Thank you, Dr. Stratton. Greetings from London. Hello, everyone. My name is Anne Pollock Elser, and I'm a London tourist guide. I'm American, but I've lived in London for almost 21 years now. And I'm sorry I can't be out filming on location for you this evening. But due to the pandemic, London is still in full lockdown and all the pubs are closed. But I think I've created a fun and engaging virtual pub crawl for you this evening that you can enjoy from the comfort of your very own living room. I'll speak for just under an hour, about 45 minutes. I'll talk about the history of pubs and what makes them so special and such an important part of British life. I'll talk about some of the popular food and drink that you find in pubs, and then I'll share with you some of the fun history and quirky stories behind a few of my favorite pubs. So without further ado, let's get started. I'll just share my screen. Right. So I hope you've poured yourself a nice glass of beer, or perhaps a gin and tonic, or maybe a cup of hot tea is more your style. Whatever your beverage of choice is, please sit back and relax and enjoy the talk. Now, to really get you in the mood, I need to transform you virtually to London. So I've created a little magic curtain to take us there. And here we go. Welcome to London, everyone. So on the left-hand side, you can see the famous clock tower of Big Ben, which is attached to the Houses of Parliament, where all the laws in the United Kingdom are made. And on the right-hand side are a few of the iconic red telephone boxes that you still see scattered around the city. And of course, Her Majesty the Queen, Elizabeth II, riding in her carriage on her official birthday a couple of years ago, and the changing of the guard outside of Buckingham Palace. And finally, we have the iconic dome of St. Paul's Cathedral. So I think we've established ourselves in London. The other thing that tourists love to see or experience when they come to London is to spend a bit of time in a traditional London pub. Here is a picture of me with a couple of my friends, and we're in my local neighborhood pub. So what makes them so special? Well, unlike a restaurant or a bar, a pub is really a place where you can feel at home. It is an extension of your living room. You can be quite anonymous. You don't have to engage with anyone if you don't want to. You don't have to, there's no wait staff. You order food and drinks from the bar. If you want to, you can sit on the sofa and read the paper all day without talking to anyone. I've seen people do that. Or you can get up and walk around the room and chat to people. It's entirely up to you. But unlike in a bar, you might feel a bit more uncomfortable being on your own and being ignored by everybody else, which isn't the case in a pub. They're also very comforting. They tend to have comfortable seating, often a roaring fire, particularly during the winter months. And they provide an oasis from the busy world outside. And in inclement weather, they're also a great place to escape. One of the great traditions in Britain is to go on a pub walk. And in the countryside, this might involve parking your car at one pub and having a pint of beer there, and then walking to another pub and having lunch. And you can get your exercise in as well as a lovely pub visit. The pub that tends to be near your home is often referred to as my local. And you can pop in and spontaneously see neighbors, or sometimes you might go to a pub near your place of work, in which case you would hang out with your colleagues. But they are a real focal point of the community in the same way that a post office would be, or a library. And they can be quite welcoming to dogs. You'll often see dogs sleeping by the fire in a pub or lying by the fire. And up to certain hours of the day, you can even bring in young children, so they can be family friendly for a while as well. Quizzes are a big deal in the United Kingdom. And by quizzes, I mean trivia nights. And they can get quite competitive. And they're held in pubs, often weekly. Pubs will designate a night of the week, which is quiz night. Sports are another big feature of pubs, watching sports on the television, especially soccer, what you would call soccer, what we refer to as football here. The World Cup will be shown in the pub, or any other sports match. And there are some pubs that are sports themed, so they'll have sports paraphernalia on the wall and show games throughout the day. There are other types of themed pubs like biker bars, karaoke pubs, and Irish themed pubs. There's a significant Irish community in London, and there are pubs that feature Irish paraphernalia on the wall and also serve Irish beer. In addition to having very comfortable interiors, many pubs also have areas outside where on a nice day you can sit out and have your drink there. The other very unique thing about British pubs is the history. There are pubs here that are centuries older than the United States. To sit in a pub that dates back to the time of Henry VIII, so we're talking the 1500s, is a really quite remarkable thing. They're not always in the same building that they've been in for centuries, but they're often on the same site. But the original building may have burned down or suffered during the 1940s bombing campaign of London, the Blitz. In fact, one of the other unique features of pubs is that they are survivors. They have survived the bubonic plague, and they survived the Nazi bombs in the 1940s. They have been undergoing difficult times in recent years, and I'll come back to that in a little while. Pubs also have wonderful aesthetic features, including colored glass windows and ornate mirrors, as well as polished brass fittings and tiled surfaces. Dark wood is another very common feature, especially in traditional pubs. And many have old creaky floorboards and narrow passageways and lots of little nooks and crannies where you can get lost in. The word pub comes from the term public house, which came into use in the late 17th century, so the late 1600s. And this was a term to differentiate a public drinking establishment from someone's private home. And that term eventually got shortened to pub. The original pubs date all the way back to the Romans, and the Romans came to Britain in the year 43 AD, and they soon established an extensive road network. And with that road network came tabernae, or taverns, which were the original pubs. Many of today's pubs would originally have been coaching inns that would have served horse-drawn carriages going along the roads, and they would be a place for travelers to stop for accommodation or sustenance. But pubs as we know them today really got their start during the Industrial Revolution in the early 1800s, when the population of the United Kingdom exploded and there was increasing demand for venues to drink beer. There are a lot of competing claims for which pub is the oldest in the United Kingdom. But the official honor seems to go to a pub in Hertfordshire, an area north of London. And this pub is called Ye Olde Fighting Cocks, and it is located inside an 11th century building. That's the 1000s, so we're talking roughly 700 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The idea that you can drink beer in a pub that old is really quite remarkable. On the screen now is a screenshot of a Google map. This is the heart of London, the very center of London. And that blue line running through the middle is the River Thames, the main river in the city. And each one of those red dots that you see is a pub. There are just under 4,000 pubs in London alone, and just under 50,000 in the entire country. They're everywhere, and it won't take you long to find one. And that's quite comforting to know that when you're out walking in the city, at any moment you'll soon come to a pub where you can stop and rest your feet after a busy day of sightseeing or walking, or have a drink or something to eat, or simply just use the bathroom. Many of the pubs are located along the river, along the Thames. The Thames was once the busiest river in the world. At the height of the British Empire in the 19th century, Britain was the biggest empire the world had ever seen. And this river would have been full of boats going up and down, carrying goods from around the world. Many pubs were established on the river to serve this commercial river traffic, and many still exist to this day. And they make remarkable places to go, as you can see in the photo, to sit outside right on the river. The river today is much quieter, and it's mainly used for leisure purposes, so boat tours and things like that. I mentioned a minute ago that the pubs have had difficult times in recent decades. In fact, since 1982, they've been declining. The number of pubs has been declining every year. And during the 15-year period from 1992 to 2017, a quarter of them closed. There are many reasons for this, possible reasons. One is the smoking ban instituted in 2007. Another is competition from so-called gastropubs. These are pubs that have increased in popularity since the 1990s. And a gastropub is one that puts a greater emphasis on high-end food. Not everybody likes them. Some people think they take away from the character of a traditional pub. Also, the increased availability of cheap alcohol has made it less of a necessity to go to pub to drink. And the general economic climate, with the rise in rents making it difficult for pub landlords to continue operating their premises. I have COVID here with a question mark. I mentioned that all the pubs are closed now, and they've been closed for a number of weeks. So there are some questions around whether some of them will be able to reopen. But as I mentioned before, they have survived plagues before, so I'm quite optimistic. But we'll see. I'm now going to talk about food served in pubs, which we affectionately call pub grub. The nice thing about pubs is it's comfort food. You always know what you're going to get. If you go into a pub, you can get a hamburger, you can get some kind of pasta dish and chili or any sort of comfort food like that. I'm going to talk about a few quintessentially British dishes. There are many, and we don't have time to talk about all of them, but I'll talk about a few. And perhaps the most famous example of pub grub is fish and chips. This is fish fried in batter. It's usually a form of white fish, typically cod, served with French fries, which in England are called chips. That glob of green that you can see on the side is mushy peas, which tastes a lot better than it sounds. I'm a big fan of mushy peas. So how did this dish evolve? The individual elements of fish and chips are not essentially British. The potatoes came from 17th century Belgium or France, and the idea of frying fish came from Jewish refugees from Portugal and Spain. Now, the idea of who came up with the idea to marry these two things is up for debate. But what we do know is that fish and chips were introduced into the United Kingdom in the 1860s and have been very popular ever since. To enjoy them properly, you really should have them with the mushy peas. You should also put plenty of salt and lashings of vinegar on the top. This is such a beloved dish, in fact, that it's said that during the D-Day landings on the beaches, the soldiers would call to one another, and one would call fish, and the other would call chips, and that's how they knew that they were allies. In addition to that, our wartime Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, issued a proclamation that fish and chips should be excluded from wartime food rationing. Another very popular dish in pubs is bangers and mash. The bangers are sausages on top of mashed potatoes covered with onion gravy. If you're vegetarian, don't worry, you can order veggie sausages, no problem. And this is a popular pub meal because it's quick and easy to prepare on a large scale. But it was voted Britain's most popular comfort food. Sunday roast. This is a big one. This is roast beef with roast potatoes and vegetables with something called Yorkshire pudding, which I'll come back to in a minute. But this is often eaten on a Sunday, but you can also have it just for lunch any day of the week in the pub. And it's such a popular meal in England that it's said that the French sometimes refer to the English as les roast beefs. To eat this one properly, you need to have it with all the trimmings, which are all the things I just mentioned. And I'll come back to Yorkshire pudding in a minute. The origins of this meal, we think, date back to the time when people would start cooking the meat as they were getting ready for church. When they would put the vegetables in just before walking out of the house, and it would all cook while they were at church and be ready by the time they got home. Now, the Yorkshire pudding is the thing in the middle that looks very much like a popover. In fact, that's probably the closest comparison for an American. It's made with a batter of eggs, flour, milk, and water, and comes from Yorkshire, which is an area in northern England. We think that this was originally served to fill everyone up so that they would eat less of the more expensive meat. Shepherd's pie, another one of my favorites. This is ground meat with a mashed potato topping. Strictly speaking, if you're eating a shepherd's pie, you should be having it with ground lamb, which refers to the shepherds who look after the sheep. If you're having it with ground beef, I'm afraid that's cottage pie, although I'm not sure how much people actually stick to those words, but that's the official ruling. We think this dish has its origins in the late 18th century when poorer families, this was when poorer families started to eat potatoes as a regular part of the meal, and they would have lived in cottages, hence the term cottage pie. You can also have pudding in your pub. This is the British term for dessert. There are many different types of British puddings. I'm going to talk about my favorite. This is sticky toffee pudding, and it's essentially a very moist cake, sponge cake, made of dates, served with toffee sauce and covered with vanilla custard or vanilla ice cream. Yum, yum. Don't eat this if you're trying to lose weight. We'll now come to the drinks portion of the talk. Beer and ciders. Beer and cider are the biggies. Cider refers to the alcoholic drink cider made of fermented apple juice. People also drink wine and spirits in pubs, or if you don't want alcohol at all, you don't have to have it. You can have coffee, tea, or soft drinks, or juice, whatever you like. Here we have two of the most popular gin cocktails, a martini and a gin and tonic. Why am I talking about gin? Well, gin is a London drink. In fact, London is known as the global capital of gin. It's gone in and out of favor over the centuries, but it has been enjoying a real renaissance in London in recent years. In fact, there are currently more than 20 gin distillers set up in and around the capital. Gin originally came from the Netherlands and was introduced into England in the late 1600s because we had a Dutch king, King William, and his wife Mary were on the throne. And it came here not because William was such a huge fan of gin necessarily, but because he wanted to get back at the French, who was England's big political enemy at the time. So legislation was passed to make it easier to produce and sell gin, to reduce sales of imported French brandy. There was an attempt to hurt the French economy. And there's been a strong link with gin ever since. In fact, gin became so popular during that time that that period of the early 1700s is known as the gin craze. And it got so popular that authorities started to worry that it was affecting family values and the way people were behaving. So they started to promote beer a bit more to reduce gin sales. Gin is an alcohol that is infused from the juniper berry. And the name of the drink originally was Geneva or Geneva in England, which comes from the Dutch word for juniper, which is Genever, and it eventually got shortened to gin over time. But this is such a London drink that if you're drinking a traditional or classic brand of gin, such as Tanqueray or Gordon's or Bombay Sapphire, it will say London Dry on the label. This is, again, classic unsweetened gin. And it has the designation London Dry because most producers of this type of gin were based in London. These days, you can be based anywhere in the world and produce London Dry gin. It refers to the production process, which is protected by law. Another well-known brand of London Dry gin is Beefeater gin. And the reason it's called Beefeater gin is because of this gentleman on the label. He is a yeoman warder of the Tower of London. I'll talk a bit more about the Tower in a minute. The yeoman warders are the traditional guardians of the Tower of London, and their nickname is Beefeater. We're not entirely sure how that nickname evolved, but they would have been, in the Middle Ages, the bodyguards of the king, and therefore they may have been given a better diet than other servants with more beef. Today, the Beefeaters are still around. This is the Tower of London today. It's almost 1,000 years old. It was built in around the year 1080. So again, we're talking roughly 500 years before the sailing of the Mayflower. And it's right there, sitting in the middle of London, surrounded by contemporary skyscrapers. It was originally built as a royal palace. It's been used as a fortress. It's been used as the royal mint, where coins were minted. And it was a prison and a site of many famous executions, including the executions of 2 of Henry VIII's 6 wives. But as I say, the Beefeaters are still there. There are about 37 of them, and they're all ex-military. Today, they serve mainly as tourist guides at the Tower of London. They're visitor guides, but they live on site with their families. And because of that, the Tower is a small village. It has a doctor's office, it has a church, and it also has its very own pub. This is the Beefeaters pub, which is on the grounds of the Tower of London. It's called the Keys. You're welcome to visit the Tower of London anytime. You can buy a ticket, and if next time you're able to come to London, I'd love to show you around. The pub is not open to the public. This is, you have to be invited by one of the beefeaters. I had the great pleasure of visiting this pub a couple years ago. The beefeaters take turns manning the bar, and as you might expect, there are plenty of jars, or bottles rather, of beefeater gin lining the shelves. Incidentally, the beefeaters all get a bottle of beefeater gin on their birthday every year. But now I'm going to talk about beer because this is the biggest seller in the pubs. It's the most popular drink. It accounts for about 70% of sales. There was a time where drinking beer was quite encouraged, and it was even said to be healthy for you. And even children were given beer. Granted, it was a lower alcohol beer, but it was actually considered safer to drink beer than to drink the water of London, which was quite dirty at the time. You can have bottles of beer, or you can have it from the tap on draft. There are two main types of beer. You have your ales and your lagers. And pretty much every other type of beer falls under one of those two categories. Two examples of ales would be India Pale Ale and Stout. And two brands of lager would be Budweiser as a type of lager, as well as Stella Artois, which is one of my favorite beers. So I mentioned that you can have it from a bottle or draft, but one thing that differentiates beer drinking in England from beer drinking in America is there isn't quite the emphasis on refrigeration here. In fact, people tend to drink warmer beer. I wouldn't say it's quite room temperature. It's colder than that. I would say it's basement temperature because the beer is kept in casks in the basement. But it's warmer than what you would be used to in America. I'm going to switch gears from food and drink now and talk about pub signs and pub names. Most traditional pubs still have signs hanging outside like the one you can see in the picture here. And this is a tradition that dates back to the 1300s under King Richard II, who ordered that all pubs have signs so that they'd be easy to locate by the official ale tasters. These were people who go around and stop at all the pubs to sample the ale and make sure it was up to standard. Sounds like a tough job. One of the people who had that job was William Shakespeare's father, John. Another reason for pub signs, and they would all have a picture, because they date back to a time when a large portion of the English population was illiterate. So rather than having your name on the sign, you'd have a picture so that people could find it that way. There are lots of different names of pubs, and lots of them have kind of quirky origins. One of the most popular names for pubs is the Red Lion. There are roughly 600 Red Lion pubs in the United Kingdom. One of the theories for this is King James I, who came to the throne in 1603. He was from Scotland, and the theory is that he ordered that all pubs carry the Red Lion of Scotland, which is on the flag there, the Scottish flag. Another very popular pub name is the Marquis of Granby. Marquis is a title of nobility, and it's the son of a duke. And in the 18th century, there was an army general who was a Marquis of Granby, and he apparently was very good to his men. And when they retired, he'd give them a pot of money, and many of them used the money to establish pubs, which they then named after him. Naming pubs after royalty is another very common thing. In fact, there are many, many pubs called the Crown, which is, I think, the second most popular name after the Red Lion. A number of pubs are also called the Queen Victoria, after the woman who was our queen in the 1800s, or George. We've actually had 4 kings named George here in the United Kingdom. George III may be the one you're most familiar with from your American history, or if you've seen the musical Hamilton. He was the king on the throne during the American Revolution. But 20 years after his coronation in 1780, pubs that were licensed that year were all called the Royal George in honor of his the anniversary of his coronation. Other pub names are quite quirky and funny, and some of them are thought to have evolved as corruptions of other phrases. So for example, the bag o' nails, comes from bacchanal. Goat and compasses is thought to come from the phrase, God encompass us. And the Bull and Bush pub perhaps comes from a celebration of one of Henry VIII's military victories in France at the Boulogne Bouche. Other pubs have named themselves after famous people, even if it's quite a tenuous link. And an example of this would be the Churchill Arms, which is this pub you can see covered in ivy and flowers on the screen. It's a very pretty pub, and it's located in Kensington in West London. And it's got all kinds of memorabilia to Winston Churchill on the inside. But it was renamed, this pub, it was renamed the Churchill Arms after the Second World War, because Churchill's grandparents apparently frequented the pub quite a bit in the 1800s. This is another pub with an interesting story of how its name changed and evolved. This is the Prospect of Whitby, located in a part of East London called Wapping, which is right on the river and has lots of wonderful converted warehouses because it used to be an area that served the docks. But it calls itself, or it claims to be, London's oldest riverside inn, dating back to 1520. It used to be called the Pelican, but there used to be a ship moored, sort of permanently moored at the back of the pub. And this ship was called the Prospect, and it was from a port in Yorkshire called Whitby. And this was in the 1700s. And people wouldn't say, I'm going to the Pelican. They would say, I'm going to the pub near the Prospect of Whitby. And eventually that name stuck. There's an interesting thing at the back of the Prospect of Whitby, which is a hangman's noose, and you can see it in the picture here. The reason it's there is because of something historical that used to be there. Somewhere very near the back of this pub, we're not sure exactly where, there was an area called Execution Dock, where they used to hang pirates who were captured on the high seas. They would hang them, but they wouldn't take their bodies down right away. They would leave the bodies hanging until 3 tides washed over them. The Thames is a tidal river. And you can imagine after 3 tides washed over these bodies, they would not look very pleasant. They'd be all bloated and looking horrible. And they were left there to serve as a deterrent for others going up and down the Thames to prevent further piracy. And it is said that ghosts of some of these pirates haunt the Prospect of Whitby pub. This is the 10 Bells, another East End pub. This one is in an area called Spitalfields. And it's always had the word bells in its name, although the number has changed. It refers to the number of bells that peal in the church next door. But this particular pub has associations with Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper is an unidentified serial killer of women from the late 1800s in a very impoverished area of London known as Whitechapel. Never been identified. But this pub is said to have associations with Jack the Ripper because 2 of his victims, Annie Chapman and Mary Jane Kelly, have connections here. Annie Chapman is said to have possibly had a drink in the pub before she was murdered. Mary Jane Kelly, who was a prostitute, possibly picked up her customers on the pavement outside the pub. Because of these connections, the pub was briefly named the Jack the Ripper from 1976 to 1988. A group of female activists eventually campaigned to have the name changed back because it wasn't appropriate to glorify a serial killer in that way. So it was renamed the 10 Bells. An interesting aside is that the English chef Jamie Oliver's great-great-grandfather was the landlord of this pub during
the time of Jack the Ripper in the 1880s.
I'm now going to talk to you about another one of my absolute favorite pubs in London. And this one is a favorite because of its connections to American history. It's in an area of southeast London called Rotherhithe, and it's called the Mayflower. And the reason it's called the Mayflower is because of the pub's connections with the famous boat that took the religious separatists we call the Pilgrims from Plymouth, England, to what became the United States of America, the New World, in 1620. So this was 400 years ago last year. And the reason it's connected to Rotherhithe is because Rotherhithe in southeast London was the home port of the Mayflower. The boat was based here. So it would have set off from this part of London on the first leg of its journey. We think there was actually a pub standing here at the time of the Mayflower. In fact, as early as the 1500s. This particular building dates from the 18th century, and it wasn't renamed the Mayflower until the 1950s when the pub had to undergo some renovations and they decided to rename it to capitalize on its connections to the boat. According to local folklore, the boat was actually moored, possibly right outside the pub, but definitely somewhere very close to it. And the reason the boat was here was because its captain, Christopher Jones, lived in Rotherhithe, and he was buried here in the church. Just next to the pub is the local parish church called St. Mary's Rotherhithe, and he's buried in the churchyard. He brought the ship back and died less than a year later in 1622. Now, inside the pub, they have all kinds of Mayflower memorabilia. They have models of the ship, they have the names of the passengers, and they also have a descendants book. So if you can claim to be a descendant of one of the Mayflower passengers, you can sign the book. And this is my friend Emily in the photo, who is a Mayflower descendant. And she signed the book not too long ago when I was with her. And she got very emotional. She wasn't expecting to, but it was very exciting when she signed the book.
Now I'm going to talk about another pub with connections to America. And I know what you're probably thinking. You're looking at the picture and saying, well, that doesn't look like a pub. Looks like a law office. And you'd be right. This is Mackintosh Law, which is located in a part of London called Southwark, which is south of the river. This is an example of a site that used to be a pub. And it was called the Queen's Head. And in fact, the little alleyway just next to this law office is still called Queen's Head Yard. At the base of this law office, you can't see it in the photo, but there's a plaque. And the plaque says, "The Queen's Head Inn, owned by the family of John Harvard, founder of Harvard University, formerly stood here." So John Harvard, who was the original benefactor of Harvard University, was born and raised in this part of London. He was baptized in Southwark at the local cathedral. He went to school here before going off to Cambridge University. And his parents owned a number of properties in the area, including the Queen's Head pub. And when his parents died, John Harvard inherited the proceeds from these properties. He was a Puritan, and he emigrated to America with his wife Anne in 1637 to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He also didn't live very long after that. He was only 29 or 30 at the time, but he died. But on his deathbed, he bequeathed his inheritance to the founding of the first Institute of Higher Learning in the New World, which eventually was named Harvard in his honor. Now, when they set up the school, it was in a town called Newtown, but that town was later renamed Cambridge after the town in England where Cambridge University is. So I think it's quite remarkable to think that the oldest and most prestigious the oldest and most prestigious university in America has its origins right here in Southwark because of this pub. Another one of my favorites is a pub called The Grapes, and this is another old one dating back to 1583, although the current building only dates from 1720. Practically contemporary. This one is again in the East End in a neighborhood called Limehouse. And the reason this one is fun to talk about is because of its co-owner. You may recognize this man. This is Sir Ian McKellen, who played the wizard Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings films. And he is co-owner of the Grapes Pubs. He is often seen there. He likes to take part in the Monday quizzes. I've been a couple times and not seen him, but apparently you can see Sir Ian when you go. Let's have a look at the inside. Now, you can see the inside of the pub, as well as this film still of Gandalf, and he's holding his staff. That staff, if you now look at the right side of the pub picture, the staff is behind the bar. Gandalf staff. There's also a small statue of him toward the back of the pub. I'm going to talk about one more pub this evening, and this one is called Ye Olde Cheshire Cheese. The sign says that it dates from the 1500s, but was rebuilt in 1667. And that's an important year because that's 1 year after the Great Fire of London. There was a huge fire in London in 1666 that destroyed almost the entire city. And elementary school kids study the fire. It's a big part of history here because it played a big role in how the city looks today and how it's laid out. But in any event, in addition to hundreds of houses and churches and other buildings, many, many, many pubs were destroyed in the fire and had to be rebuilt. So this Cheshire Cheese pub was rebuilt a year after in 1667. The other reason why this pub is significant is because it's located on Fleet Street, which is a famous street in London. And it's famous because for hundreds and hundreds of years, this was the home of newspapers. I'll come back to this gentleman in a minute. But newspapers were based on Fleet Street up until the 1980s. They've all since moved out to less expensive areas. But this would have been, if you were anyone who was an important journalist, would have an office here. And for that reason, there were many, many pubs and cafes lining the road where journalists would spend much of their day drinking and gossiping and trading stories. One of those journalists, you can see in the photo here, this is the writer Charles Dickens, very famous English writer from the 1800s, who you may know from writing Oliver Twist, Great Expectations, A Christmas Carol, and many, many other novels from the Victorian era. He was an editor at one of the papers on Fleet Street and therefore spent a lot of time in this pub and many other pubs in London, it must be said. This is the interior of the Cheshire Cheese, which is really wonderful. It's very cozy, has lots of narrow passageways and little nooks and crannies. You can curl up on an old worn sofa by the fire and drink your pint. And the other cool thing, it's about 4 levels, but the bottom level, the lower level, is the remains of a 13th century monastery. So the amount of history in this place is remarkable. There's another aspect to the Cheshire Cheese, which is kind of fun to talk about, fun and naughty. I'll start by saying that pubs at one point were used for a variety of different purposes. They weren't just drinking establishments. They were sometimes used, for example, as temporary courtrooms. They were also sometimes used as brothels. And in 1962, after a fire, they discovered in the Cheshire Cheese, in an upstairs room, some tiles dating back to the 18th century that were adorning a fireplace, and they were quite erotic in nature. You can see these tiles online. I didn't know if I had the copyright to put them in the presentation tonight, but if you just Google Cheshire Cheese pub tiles later on, you'll be able to see them. They are quite explicit. They have been on display at least once, as far as I know, but they are currently in the collection of the Museum of London, and they're in storage. This last slide shows what the bartender says right before closing time. Most pubs during normal times close at about 11 o'clock. And a bit before that time, they'll ring a bell for last orders, or they'll just shout out last orders. And this is my final slide of the evening.
Thank you so much for joining me this evening for this talk about London pubs. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions about the presentation, please feel free to get in touch with Kari Pollock at the Stamford Hospital Foundation. And on behalf of the Tastings Committee, I would like to express our gratitude for your continued support of the Bennett Cancer Center, and to remind you that the funding from tonight's raffle and Fund a Need will go towards supportive services free of charge for Bennett Cancer Center patients and their families. If you haven't already done so, please consider buying a raffle ticket or funding a need of your choice. The raffle and Fund a Need will be open until 9 p.m. and you can use the QR code to access the raffle and Fund a Need platform. And I should mention that among the raffle prizes are a couple real-life tours of London with yours truly. So I do hope to welcome at least some of you to London for real sometime in the not too distant future when we're all free to travel again. Until then, please stay safe. Best wishes and thanks again. Good night.